Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello everyone. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. My name is Zamanullah Sand. I facilitate virtual programs at Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to a whole normal of face-to-face conferences. I welcome you all who are joined with people from Afghanistan, Indonesia, Thailand, Tokyo, Myanmar, Scotland, Vietnam, Poland, Turkey, Pakistan, Thailand, such a diverse audience. I welcome you all. Thanks very much for joining us. And now it's my privilege and honor to introduce for this webinar, Professor Paul Nation. Professor Paul Nation is a Professor Emeritus of Applied Linguistics in the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. His latest books include How Vocabulary is Learned, published in 2017 with Scott Webb, Teaching Extensive Reading in Another Language 2020 with Rob Waring, and Mirroring a Native Speaker Vocabulary Size with Avril Coxhead, and second editions of a Language Curriculum Design published in 2020, Teaching ESL and EFL Listening and Speaking published in 2020, and Teaching ESL and EFL Reading and Writing published in 2020. His web resources site contains many free resources for teachers and researchers, including books, word lists, vocabulary tests, articles, and resources for speed reading and extensive reading. What an honor to have you at Teacher Development Webinars, Paul. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Good. Okay. So, whoops. Have to do, where do I get? Oh, here we go. Okay. Now, is it the right one? Yep. F5.
Yep.
F5. Oops.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to slideshow.
Slideshow.
Okay. Good. Okay, you ready to go?
Good to go. Take us away.
Good to go.
Ready to go.
Okay, good. This evening in New Zealand, I'm going to talk about some very basic things, but I'm going to start off by talking about what I think are the 20 most useful teaching techniques. I think that some of these techniques are actually essential for language learning and for having a good balanced language course. Some are not so essential, but they need, if you want to replace them, you would need to replace them with something which is somewhat similar. So let's, this is not trying to make me money, folks. The first book here is a book which is free, and I wrote this for teachers of English in New Zealand, where English is a second language. But I also wrote another book, which unfortunately has to be bought, but you can buy it through Amazon and it's available in electronic form and it's not too expensive. But in this book, What Should Every EFL Teacher Know? I tried to write down the most important things that any teacher who teaches English as a foreign language should be aware of. And I figured that after 50 years of, or more than 50 years of training teachers and reading the research and supervising research and doing lots of writing, that I should be able to set down in a fairly short and direct way what I think is really important for teaching English as a foreign language. And so if you want to follow up any of the ideas that I talk about tonight, then this book, What Should Every EFL Teacher Know, is one that I recommend. It's one of the books that I had the most satisfaction when I wrote it, because I felt I've said here what I think is really important. So let's now look at what I think are the 20 most useful language teaching techniques. And I'm going to simply put them under the skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The first technique I've got here is listening to stories. And this is a very nice technique where the teacher sits down with a book which is at the right level for the learners and sits and reads the book to the learners, just like telling them a story. And whenever a word or a phrase occurs that might cause some difficulty for the learners, the teacher writes it on the whiteboard and maybe gives a quick explanation of its meaning, but then carries on with the story. And this goes on for about 10 minutes or 15 minutes until you reach an exciting part of the story, and then you close the book and say, to be continued in the next class. And the next time that you meet with the students, then the story continues. And it's simply a listening technique, part of what I would call meaning-focused input, where the learners just get practice in listening to the language, and the language that they're listening to is largely already known to them. No more than 1 or 2 unknown words per 100 words. The second technique I've got under listening is read and listen. And that is, while the learners read a graded reader, they also listen to a recorded version of the graded reader. And this is very easy to do nowadays because most graded readers come with a tape recording of some sort, some file that you can listen to. And this technique is useful for relating reading and listening together and for helping either of those skills or both of them. I put it under listening because listening involves much slower language input than reading should. When we listen at roughly, as native speakers, roughly around about 130 to 150 words per minute. When we read, we should be reading at around about 200, 250 words per minute. So reading is much faster. But this technique of read and listen is a way of supporting listening. And then the third technique I've got here for listening is dictation. And this is part of what I would call language-focused learning, where you actually focus on features of the language and give deliberate attention to vocabulary and to grammar and so on. And dictation is a very old technique, but it's actually one that I still think is very useful for language learning because the learners get feedback on their listening. They hear the text at least 3, maybe 4 times, and they have a chance to check their listening skill by writing down what they hear. Now, for each of these techniques, you can go to my website, and if you look around on the website, and to find it, you just type Paul Nation Resources into Google, and that'll take you to the right site. And there are videos for each of these techniques. The videos are very short, only about 5-6 minutes, but each one of these activities is demonstrated in a video that you can watch free from my website. Let's now look at what I think are the most important speaking activities for a language course. Pair conversation activities cover a lot of different activities where the learners work in pairs, talking to each other. You could have group conversation as well as pair conversation. I wouldn't see a big difference between those two. But it's an opportunity to practice learners' dialogue, talking and listening at the same time. Then we have prepared talks, which is really monologue, where the learners work on preparing a talk, and once they're happy with what they've prepared, then they deliver that talk to a small group of class members, and having practiced it in a small group, can then give the talk to the whole class. And this, I think, is a very useful speaking practice activity. Then we have problem-solving activities. So often they involve role play, and these can be activities such as ranking or choosing, making a choice about some item, or trying to work out a solution to a problem. And there are many, many useful speaking activities which fit under problem-solving speaking. And then we have activities which focus on the language aspect of speaking. One is the same or different activity, where the teacher simply says two sounds, and one of those sounds is difficult for the learners. So if it's, for example, the sound the, as in the word the, or that, or then the teacher might contrast this with the errors that the learners might make in either z or d, depending on their language background. And the teacher just simply says da, tha. Are they the same or different? If they're different, raise your hand. If they're the same, tha, then don't do anything. And this is a very useful technique to get learners focusing on particular sounds so that they learn to differentiate important sounds in English. And then identifying is very similar to that, except instead of hearing two sounds and having to say whether they're the same or different, the learner just hears one sound. And if they hear the sound the, then they raise their hand. And if they hear the sound d, then they don't raise their hand. So the teacher will say things like, nonsense words are best, saying things like da, tha, the, though, D, and so on, and then getting the learners to do it. And these are very simple activities which can be done with a large class and give practice in identifying particular sounds. And then we have a fluency development activity for speaking. And this is one of my favorite activities. There's been quite a lot of research done on this activity, and that's the 4-3-2 activity. In this activity, the learners work in pairs, and one learner in a pair is the listener and the other is the speaker. And then the speaker talks about a very easy topic, something that they know quite a lot about. And the listener just listens. Now, the teacher says, okay, are you ready? Go. And so the speaker starts speaking and the learners listen, and they're speaking to one person, so they're working in pairs. And then after 4 minutes, the teacher says, stop, change partners, and the speaker stays where they are and the listener moves on to another speaker, and that's each speaker then has a different listener. The teacher says, good. Are you ready? Go. And then the speaker gives exactly the same talk again, but this time for 3 minutes. So they've got 1 minute less to deliver the talk. And after 3 minutes, the teacher says, stop, change partners, and then you do the same again with a new partner for 2 minutes. And over the period of 7 or 8 minutes, 9 or 10 minutes, 4 plus 3 plus 2. Each speaker delivers their talk 3 times, and each listener listens to 3 different talks. This is a useful fluency development activity because it involves very easy material. There is some pressure to go faster because of the decreasing time. And there is the opportunity for repetition to occur, which also makes it easier to go faster. Now we look at reading. And top of the list in reading is extensive reading. The most important change or addition that a teacher can make to a language course is to add an extensive reading program. If your language course is a general language course and you don't have an extensive reading program, then your learners are missing out on one of the most effective ways of learning a language. In English, learners are very lucky because there are thousands of graded readers written from around about the 50-word level up to the 3,000 or 4,000 word level. And there are even some other graded readers which you can get free on my website called the mid-frequency readers, which are at the 4,000, 6,000 and 8,000 word level. An extensive reading is simply the learner sitting down and individually, quietly reading a book which is at the right level for them. There shouldn't be any exercises based on the activity, and they shouldn't have to write a big report. They should simply have to read for pleasure and keep some kind of record of their reading. I was just at a conference this afternoon, about 6 hours ago, by the Thai Extensive Reading Foundation and the Thai Extensive Reading Association. And they were talking about a program called X Reading, which is an online program where learners get access to about, I think it's 1,400 different graded readers. It's a subscription service, and it's usually done for a whole class. But the learners can have access to 1,400 different graded readers at many different levels, and it keeps a record of their amount of reading done, and the quiz scores that they answer, and how fast they are reading, and all sorts of things. It makes extensive reading very easy. But extensive reading programs are very effective, and they need to be a part of each language course. Paired reading is learners reading together. This is really a kind of intensive reading, but the learners work together to read a text. They can look up a dictionary, they ask each other for explanation and help, and they just work their way through a reading text, which is not too difficult for them. Intensive reading is where we give attention to language features in reading. And intensive reading is an important part of a language course. One application of intensive reading is grammar translation. And I quite like grammar translation because grammar translation can deal with problems that learners have in reading and help in their vocab and their grammar development. But intensive reading should only occupy a small part of a language course, less than 1/16 of the time in a language course. But it is an important part. And then we have the fourth technique, which I've listed for reading, is speed reading, where learners improve their reading fluency. There are two ways of doing this. One way is to do a speed reading course. And if you look on my website, you will find that there are many free speed reading courses available, most of them written by Sonia Millett, one of my colleagues. And you can do a speed reading course at the 500 word level, the 1,000 word level, the 2,000 word level, 2,000 plus academic word list level. And all of these courses are freely available from my website. A speed reading course can help learners increase their reading speed. They consist of usually 20 passages with 10 questions for each passage, and the learners time their reading and answer a short comprehension quiz on each passage and keep a record of their score. Most learners increase their reading speed by about 50% over the 20 passages, and some learners double their reading speed. And if you increase your reading speed, then you can read more and you can do more extensive reading in the same time. We come to writing. The first technique here is writing with feedback. So the learners do a piece of writing and the teacher marks the piece of writing and gives them some feedback on the errors. There's lots of ways of giving feedback. One that I favor is for the teacher to mark where the error is and to put a little symbol in the margin of the writing, such as A for article usage, or P for punctuation, or G for grammar, or so on. And the teacher doesn't correct the errors, but indicates where the error is and what kind of error it is. And then the learners try to make the correction themselves. If they find that they can't make the correction, then they can ask the teacher for help on that particular error. Learners end up being able to correct most of their errors themselves because when they look at where the error is and what sort of error it is, then it becomes fairly obvious to them what they should do to correct it. Information transfer is another activity for writing, where the learners look at information in tables and then try and turn the table into a written paragraph or form. I like substitution tables as well. Substitution tables are a little bit like dictation. They've been around a long time and they seem a little old-fashioned, but they're really excellent ways of getting learners to make correct sentences, making substitutions within the tables. If you look on my website, you will find a link to a list of writing by H.V. George, and included in that is his book, 101 Substitution Tables, and you can download this book of substitution tables free. And then we have a fluency development activity for writing, which is 10-minute writing, where each learner writes for 10 minutes on any topic that they like, and at the end of 10 minutes, they stop writing and count the number of words that they've written. Then the teacher might read their writing or read it very quickly, but doesn't correct it. It's really important for fluency development that teachers don't correct the writing, because if the learners think that the teacher is worried about the grammar of that piece of writing, then they will slow down and write much more carefully. And writing with care is important when you do writing with feedback, but when you do writing for fluency development, it's really important that the learner only worries about the content and tries to write as much as possible. The learner enters the number of words they have written on a graph, and each week when they do 10-minute writing, they try to write more words in the same time. And then we have 3 general purpose activities, which bring us up to 20 different techniques. These are linked skills activities, where learners focus on the same material 3 different times, but each time through a different skill. So they might listen to a text, then they might read the text, and then they might write about what they read and listened to. Or they might write about a topic that they know something about, and then they read something about that topic, and then they might have to speak about that particular topic. If you want to find more about linked skills activities, look in the first book that I mentioned, What Should Every ESL Teacher Know? And there's a whole chapter in that on linked skills activities and how to make them. Issue logs are activities that the learners work on individually. They choose a topic such as pollution or global warming or something more pleasant such as food. And then they do some reading and research on that topic, gathering information. And they talk about it with a little group of people each week, reporting on what they've read and what they've found out. And they spend a few minutes talking like that. And then at the end of a period of weeks, they may then make a written presentation of what they have gathered on that topic, and also an oral presentation of it. So this gives the learners practice in the skill of reading for information, writing down the information, presenting information orally. And it's a good opportunity to develop vocabulary within a narrow topic area and get plenty of repetition of that vocabulary. And then the final technique I've got here is learning from word cards. You can see that I'm a very old-fashioned teacher because word cards involve rote learning. A lot of people think that rote learning, a word with its first language translation, is not a good thing to do. People who think that haven't read the research. If you read the research, you will find that there's a lot of research showing that this activity of deliberate learning from word cards is a very, very effective technique, and you can learn large amounts of vocabulary in a very short time. It used to be argued that this kind of learning just results in explicit knowledge and not the knowledge you need for normal language use. Recent research by one of our PhD students in New Zealand has shown that this is actually incorrect. When people do deliberate rote learning from word cards or from a flashcard program, because there's some very good flashcard programs you can put onto your cell phone, they not only develop explicit knowledge of that vocabulary, but they also develop the implicit knowledge which is needed for normal language use. So these are my 20 top language teaching techniques. And I think with just these techniques, you can have a very effective and a well-balanced course. Okay. So we've covered what I think are the most important sorts of activities in a course. Now let's look at what you can do to improve your language course. And so what I've done here is to rank a list of what I think are the most effective changes that you could make to a language program. If you're not happy about the language program you're working on and you want to improve it, the first thing that I would look at is to see, is there an extensive reading program at the appropriate levels for input and fluency development? And if you don't have an extensive reading program as a part of your course, then you should find out about extensive reading, find out what it is, and see how you can make it a part of your course. Rob Waring and I published a book a year or two ago on setting up extensive reading programs and all of the published research on extensive reading and so on. And so there's a lot of information that we now have about extensive reading. And it is a very effective way where learners work individually at the level which is suitable for them in order to develop their language skill and their language knowledge. So for me, this is the number one change that any teacher could make to a language course. This is the change which will have the most effect on improving the learner's language learning. And if you haven't heard much about extensive reading, then go to the website of the Extensive Reading Foundation, and you'll get a lot of information there. And also go to a website called ER, Extensive Reading, ER Central, which also has a lot of free materials for language learners and a lot of information about extensive reading. The second most effective change that a teacher could make to a language program is to add a fluency development program. About a quarter of the time in a language program should be spent on fluency development. And fluency development should cover each of the 4 skills. You should have a listening fluency part of the program, a speaking fluency part of the program, a reading fluency part of the program, and a writing fluency part of the program. I've mentioned the techniques for speaking fluency, 432, for reading fluency, which is speed reading course, and for writing fluency, which is 10-minute writing. And these very simple techniques are very effective in helping the learners make the most effective use of what they already know. Fluency development doesn't involve learning new language material. It involves making the best use of the language you already know. And even at the very elementary levels of language learning, learners should be able to know and use what they know fluently. Most people don't know this, but I actually speak Japanese very fluently. but I only know about 200 or 300 words in Japanese, but I can speak them very fluently indeed. And as long as nobody changes the topic or asks me difficult questions, I can appear to be a very fluent speaker of Japanese. So even though I'm at the very elementary level of learning Japanese, I am fluent in what I know. And that's the aim of a fluency development program. So that's number 2 on the list of most effective, significant changes you could make to a program. The third most effective change is for peer listening and speaking. And that's getting learners talking to each other. And that, of course, involves listening and speaking, because one listens, one speaks, and so on. And these are really important because learners don't get enough practice usually when English is taught as a foreign language in actually using the language of speech and having to listen to speech. Then I would include, as my number 4 change, linked skills activities. I really like the linked skills activity where the learners focus on exactly the same material 3 different times, one after the other, but each time using a different skill. This activity sets up ideal conditions for vocabulary learning because the same material is repeated 3 times. And it's repeated with variations because each time it's with a different skill. So if you don't know about linked skills activities, go to that Corpus publishing website and download a free copy of What Should Every ESL Teacher Know, and look at the chapter on linked skills activities there. And then number 5, I would include vocabulary size testing. Now, in order to test your learners' vocabulary knowledge, you need to use one of the vocabulary levels tests, which are on my website. Now, you need to distinguish between vocabulary levels tests and vocabulary size tests. And I think that for learners of English as a foreign language, the vocabulary levels tests are the best tests to use. And there are 2 of them on my website. They weren't developed by me, but they were based on a design that I used many years ago. And these tests are free, and they allow you to find out how many words your learners know at the 1,000 word level, at the 2,000 word level, at the 3,000 word level, and so on. And you can just give parts of these tests, just the first 1,000 level or the first 2,000 word levels, in order to get information about your learners. And because I do a lot of work on vocabulary, I think that knowing how many words your learners know is a good guide to help you in developing extensive reading and in doing activities which will help them develop their vocabulary knowledge. So they are the 5 most effective changes I think you could make to your language course. And if you're going to come to conferences and seminars like this, you should use these as an opportunity to actually make a change to your course. And so that's the reason why I've included these list and ranked activities. Okay, we're getting near the end of it. Now, what are the teacher's jobs? Most teachers think that a teacher's job is fairly obvious, to teach. But in fact, I put teaching as number 5 on the list of teachers' jobs. At number 1, I put plan a good course. And that means the teacher should make sure that the learners are focusing on material which is at the right level for them. The teacher has tested their vocabulary knowledge and therefore knows what sort of material is at the right level. And then the teacher then works out getting a balance of activities across listening, speaking, reading, and writing, which give learners good opportunity to develop their knowledge of each of those 4 skills. So the number 1 job for a teacher is making sure that you're using a good range of teaching techniques, which cover the 4 skills and which give a balance of learning from input and output and from focusing on the language and for fluency development. The number 2 job of the teacher is to organize learning opportunities. And so that's things like making sure that extensive reading is going well in the classroom, setting up group learning activities for speaking activities, for paired reading and so on, and making sure that these work well. Organizing individual work for learners and monitoring that individual work so that the learners are encouraged to keep on doing their learning. The number 3 job of the teacher is to train learners in language learning strategies. And there are many strategies that are important for language learning. Rote learning using word cards or flashcards is one strategy that I recommended. Another vocabulary strategy is training and guessing from context. Another vocabulary-based strategy is using word parts such as prefixes and suffixes to help learn and remember the meanings of words. But there are many other strategies associated with reading and writing and so on. And training the learners how to do this is an important part of a language course. Within this training and strategies, I would also include getting learners to understand the principles of language learning. And the next thing we're going to look at in this talk after this slide is some of the principles of language learning. And I think teachers should understand these principles and should see how the techniques that they use apply the principles. But I also think that language learners also need to know how to learn. One of my favorite stories about that goes back to a time when I was working outside and I fell over and I hurt my shoulder. And so I went to the physiotherapist and he gave me some exercises to do, and I got talking to him. And it turned out that he was a good friend of my nephew. And he was a good friend of my nephew because they both worked together in the post office. They were technicians working on telephones and things like that. And he explained how he became a physiotherapist. He said that when he was working in the post office, they had to do courses, you know, learning about technology and all of these sorts of things. And on one of the courses he went to, the teacher explained to them how to learn the material in the course. Didn't just explain the material, but said, look, if you want to remember these things, here's what you should do. So he gave them some advice about learning. Now, the advice he gave them wasn't that great. It was okay, but it was advice like, you know, write the main ideas onto little pieces of paper and stick them onto your refrigerator, put them in the bathroom, put them where you see them so you keep noticing in them and so on. It's okay, but there are actually much better ways of going about learning than that. But anyway, when he did this, he found that he actually learned very well. And he said, when I was at secondary school, I thought I was dumb because I wasn't scoring very well in my exams or anything. But when I got some understanding about how I could improve my learning, then I thought, well, maybe I'm not dumb after all. And so when he was made redundant from the post office with a big cutback because of technology, he went and studied a course in physiology and physiotherapy and became one of the leading physiotherapists in New Zealand. And that was because his teacher showed him how to learn, not only what to learn, but how to learn. So I'm a great believer in letting learners understand the principles of learning which lie behind language learning and many other types of learning. The fourth job of the teacher is to test, and that is to test the learners to see where they are in their language knowledge. And then the fifth job is to teach. If you look at the 20 techniques again that I talked about at the beginning of this talk, you will see that many of these techniques actually don't involve teaching. Extensive reading doesn't involve teaching. The 4-3-2 activity for speaking doesn't involve teaching. 10-minute writing doesn't involve teaching. These are activities that the learners do, and they learn by doing the activities. The teacher doesn't have to stand up in front of the class laying down the law. In fact, teaching, where the teacher actually explains about the language and delivers information at the front of the class, should only make up a very small proportion of the course time. I would say much less than a quarter of the course time. The rest of the course time should be the learners doing the activities like the ones I've mentioned and getting on with the job of learning and using the language. Now, moving on to some principles, and I think I better have a drink of water at this point. Beautiful New Zealand water. I'm a new man again now. Okay. A very important principle for me is the principle of the 4 strands. And the principle of the 4 strands simply says this: if you want to know if your language course is well balanced or not, then you should have 4 equally sized strands within your course. You should have an input strand where the learners listen and read while focusing on the meaning of what they listen and read. That should occupy 1/4 of the course time. You should have an output strand, and that should also occupy 1/4 of the course time. And this is where the learners speak and write. And they speak and write not by focusing on grammar or vocabulary or anything like that, but simply doing activities which involve speaking and writing. And then 1/4 of the course time should be spent on language-focused learning, which is studying the language. And some of the techniques that I mentioned earlier that fit into this language-focused learning strand are techniques like dictation, identifying sounds, distinguishing sounds, intensive reading. These are activities where there's a deliberate focus on language. But this deliberate focus on language shouldn't occupy more than 1/4 of the total course time. And then the 4th strand is fluency development. And that's fluency development in each of the 4 skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And so 1/4 of the course time should be spent on developing fluency. So if you want to know whether your course is a well-balanced course or not, then look at the activities that you use and the amount of time on each activity and see what strand each activity fits into, and then see if you're getting a roughly equal balance of time in each of those 4 strands. So this very important principle really is a planning principle. This is where the most important job of the teacher lies, and that is making sure that the learners get a balance of opportunities for learning. You might notice that 3 of these strands, meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, and fluency development, simply focus on language use across the 4 skills. And 1/4, or the strand of language-focused learning, focuses on language features like pronunciation, spelling, vocabulary, grammar, discourse, and so on. And I would also put strategy training as a part of the language-focused learning strand. Okay, so we've now looked at the 4 strands principle. The second principle that I want to focus on tonight is the principle of input. And that is that about 1/4 of the time in a language course should be spent on the learners getting input through reading and listening, which is at the right level for them. The third principle is the time on task principle. And that principle says, if you want to be good at speaking, do lots of speaking. If you want to be good at reading, do lots of reading. And the more time you spend on doing that particular skill or working on that particular kind of task, the better you will be at that task. This is a rather crude principle, but it's a principle that always works. You don't get good at speaking by not speaking, and you don't get good at reading by not reading. You get good at doing each particular skill by spending time on that skill. And then the fourth principle is the principle of direction of effort. Wherever you direct your learning effort, that's where the learning will occur. So if you focus on the form of language, then you will learn the form of language. But if you focus on the meaning of language, then you're more likely to learn the meaning of language. And a lot of the activities that we do in class can be usefully analyzed to see when a learner does this activity, what aspect of language becomes the focus, because that will become the source of learning. Okay, let me conclude by giving you some websites where you can get some free resources as a teacher. The Complete Lexical Tutor is a website set up by Tom Cobb in Canada, and this has lots of resources, particularly for vocabulary learning and for text analysis. If you look on my resources website, just type Paul Nation Resources into Google, you'll get there. And then there's also an online vocabulary size test that you can get free by going to www.my.vocabularysize.com. Well, we've covered quite a lot in tonight's talk, but the message I want you to really take away from this is that here you are, you're spending about an hour coming to a seminar. You should make sure that this hour does result in some change in your course. So at the very least, look across the activities I've suggested, and if you find that you're not using some of those activities, pick one or two of them and give them a go. If you want to be even braver, look at extensive reading and see how you can make extensive reading a part of your course. But make sure that you use this time that you have to help improve the learning of your learners. Thank you, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions, as long as you keep them easily.
Thank you so very much, Professor Paul, for such a wonderful talk. And we are delighted to have houseful for your talk, and equally, people attending on the live stream on Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel. It was, very insightful, and we appreciate your presence today. Now the floor is open for the question and answers. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. So yeah, we have a question from Nadeem Khan. He asked that you mentioned about strategy training. How do you, explain that?
Say it again. Asked about
strategy training.
Strategy training.
So could you, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned vocabulary learning strategies, and I would rank the four most important vocabulary learning strategies as number one would be guessing from context. Number two would be deliberate learning from word cards. And this is a strategy because there are certain principles to apply when you do learning from word cards, such as using spaced repetition and using retrieval. That is where you can't see what's on the back of the card and you have to retrieve it. And learners need some training in doing this well. And the strategy of using word parts, if you go to my website and look under publications, you'll find an article about the word part strategy, and that explains them and gives the most important prefixes and suffixes and so on that learners can use. But there are strategies for reading and for writing, and I don't have time to get into them here, but the strategies come back to principles of learning usually. And those principles involve things like getting repetition, getting varied input, and processing, increasing the processing quality. Your question's quite a wide one to try and answer, but within each skill, there are 2 or 3 really important strategies that you can develop. I've talked about the vocab ones, but I haven't got on to the other ones yet. Any further questions? I'm looking through, can't see any, or?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Sorry.
Oh,
so Nia
okay.
asked, how is your point of view dealing with a time factor in learning a language? How should teacher manage the allocated time in classroom activities?
You mean, how do you allocate the time for different kinds of learning?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, the principle I mentioned of the 4 strands is, for me, one of the most important principles of language learning. And so one of the ways that you could try to apply this is, I hope my PowerPoint can be made available, but if it can't, I can easily attach a handout that you can get and look at. But one of the things you could do would be to look at the 20 techniques that I mentioned and try to fit them into the 4 strands. And you should find that those techniques give quite a good balance of activity across the 4 strands of meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, language-focused learning, and fluency development. And my choice of the 20 techniques was guided by the fact that they cover the 4 strands in a fairly balanced way. So that would be my number 1 way of trying to make sure that your course is well balanced. Have a look at come to an understanding of what the 4 strands are, fit the activities that you're doing into those strands, and see how much time you're giving to each of them. And if you're spending most of your time on language-focused learning, then you should be changing what you're doing and cutting down the language-focused learning and increasing the amount of fluency development and meaning-focused input and meaning-focused output. Next question.
So another question from Yasin Pyar. He's from Pakistan. He asked, how can ELTs overcome the language barrier, like dual language translation methods, influence of a colonial mentality?
Overcoming the language barrier. Yeah.
Yep. Dual language and colonial mindset.
It's really important for meaning-focused input and meaning-focused output that learners are listening and reading at the right level for them and are doing speaking activities which are at the right level for them. What this means for almost every class is that you need to have activities which are largely individualized, or at least based on groups within the classroom. One of the reasons why extensive reading is such a useful activity is because each learner can read different material, and that material should be at the right level for them. Learners can choose their own material, but it's really important that the material's at the right level. From a vocabulary perspective, at the right level means there are no more than 2 words per 100 running words which are unfamiliar to the learners. So that means that a learner needs to choose material where there's only about 1 unknown word in every 5 lines of the reading material. Now, speaking and writing is the same. Learners should be doing activities which require only a very small amount of new vocabulary and grammar knowledge, and where they largely are working with what they already know. Now, in the fluency development strand, there should be no new material at all. You don't get fluent by dealing with material which is too difficult for you. You get fluent by using things you already know and get good at using that as quickly as possible, both through listening and reading, but also speaking and writing as well. Okay, next.
And there's another question from Kozin. She's from Iraq. She asks, what should EFL teachers do to make online classes interesting and compelling?
Well, I'm not so worried about making online classes interesting, and I tell you why. It goes back to what I said before. Language learning doesn't involve the teacher doing lots of teaching. Language learning involves the teacher organizing planning the learner's learning and organizing the learner's learning. And so I think that most language learning really occurs without the teacher presenting material. So I'm not too fussed about getting fancy presentation through online material. I'm more worried about, can the learners get lots of reading material online? Can the learners get lots of listening material online? And this doesn't involve fancy presentation or anything. It involves getting access to material at the right level. And it's the same for fluency development. If you want to become fluent in reading, you should read material which is at the right level for you. And this material doesn't have to be beautifully presented or anything like that. It has to be at the right level for the learner. And so that means that the learners need to be working on material which is suited to their level, and each learner could be working on different levels of material. So I'm not too fussed about, dealing with an activity which people are sitting there looking at the screen and getting excited. I'm more interested in material which gets learners working individually on material at the right level for them. So it's not really an answer to your question, but it's really showing where your question fits into the wider scheme of things.
Yeah, appreciate that. So next question is from Sundeep, and he asks about any ideas if Corpus can we can use Corpus for vocabulary learning, and if you could share any ideas on that.
Yeah, corpus-based learning. Tom Cobb's website has some useful corpus-based materials. But once again, I want to think about, where does corpus work fit into the four strands? And it seems to me corpus work probably fits into language-focused learning. That is, studying some aspect of the language. Corpus work is very good for deliberate vocabulary learning, for example, where you can get several examples of the same word or phrase and look at all of those examples next to each other and thus get some repetition and varied meetings with the word or phrase you want to learn. But this is part of the language-focused learning strand, and it has to share time with extensive reading, with dictation, with feedback on writing, with strategy development and learning the principles of language learning, learning deliberate study of vocabulary with flashcards and so on. So corpus work is useful, but it will only make up a very small part of the language-focused learning strand of the course. So much less than 1/16 of the course time, such as 1/4 of one strand of a course. So I think corpus work is useful, but we have to see it as occupying only a very small part of the picture. I think its great value is in vocabulary learning, but I also know that when you look at grammatical features online, you can also learn very interesting things about them by looking at concordance entries, say, for a word like too, such as too much, too hot to eat, and so on. Because there are certain patterns which occur to those, and it makes you realize that the simplest patterns are usually the most frequent ones. But once again, look and see where they fit into the big picture. And it's only a small part of a language course.
Great.
Next.
So, yeah, the next question is from Noha. She asks, he asks, would you please give us some examples of fluency activities?
Yep. Well, I've once again, go to my website and look for those videos of language teaching activities. The fluency development activities that I've mentioned are 432 for speaking, okay? And there's quite a bit of research on 432. If you look on my website under publications, around about the 1990s or something, there were 2 or 3 articles there that I did with one of my students and by myself on the 432 activity. But there's quite a lot of recent research by Frank Boers, that's B-O-E-R-S, and his students on the 432. But that's one activity for speaking. Repeated speaking is another fluency development activity. So doing the same piece of speaking again and again at different times is a way of developing fluency as well. Quite an interesting fluency development technique, which simply uses the repetition principle, is one called headlines. So half of the class write the headline of an interesting story of something that happened to them. And if it was me as one of the students who had to write a headline, I might write the headline, "Burning Bed Brings Pleasure," because I have a very interesting story about someone who was in a bed which caught on fire, but he was very happy about it. And what happens is half of the class write headlines, and then they sit there and hold up their headline, and the other members of the class walk around and say, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell me about your story." And the person has to tell that story. And then someone else might come along and say, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell me your story." And this is just simply a way of doing something which is like 432, but where they have to repeat the same talk several times. So that's another speaking fluency activity. And so things like repeated reading, repeated speaking, repeated writing, repeated listening are all fluency development activities, but they must involve material where the learner has a lot of background knowledge and where all the language feature knowledge of vocabulary and grammar is already known. And in writing, we've looked at 10-minute writing. In listening, the listening to stories activity is a good fluency development activity. Now with many websites such as YouTube and other, I think TED Talks as well, you can actually change the speed of the website delivery of the talks and listen to them at a faster speed or a slower speed without distortion. And these are really good for fluency development. About a quarter of the time in a language course should be spent on developing language fluency. Next question.
Yeah, so there's a question, a bit long one from Azran, but let's take it. He says, "Good afternoon, Professor Nation. Stepping into ELT, the stalwarts we need to read is you, one of them, especially on curriculum and material development. However, since metacognition is nowadays a highly researched area with numerous success, number one, would you mind to put some light in developing a new kind of syllabus based on metacognition, either of the listening or reading, that would be expanded? And number two, how can we incorporate this new metacognitive instruction and its strategy used in the existing syllabus or curriculum?"
Yeah, well, my answer is going to be similar to what some of the previous answers I've given. So metacognition really means stepping back and thinking about, looking at what you are doing and reflecting on what you are doing and thinking about what you are doing. And for me, this is a kind of language-focused learning. And so that means that metacognition can be a very useful thing in a language course, but once again, it should only be a small part of the course. And I would see it as fitting into the strategy development part of the language-focused learning strand. Now, one of the values of the Four Strands principle is that if someone asks you a question such as, how do you teach listening? Or how do you teach reading? Or how do you teach writing? My answer to that is always the same, the four strands. If you want to learn how to listen, then you have to spend about half of your time doing meaning-focused input. That is, doing lots of listening which is at the right level for you. Now, the reason it's half of the time is because listening is an input activity, not an output activity. So we just double the amount of input time to compensate for the lack of output. And 1/4 of the time should be spent on studying the language and metacognitive and principle and strategy aspect of listening. And 1/4 of the time in a listening course should be spent on becoming fluent in listening. So I think that metacognition is good. It would be a part, for example, in a listening course of intensive listening, where learners listen to a short text with the guidance of the teacher and then reflect on the aspects of the listening. For example, can we see a certain arrangement of information in the talking? Or are the same information constituents occurring in this particular piece of listening that we can find in other pieces of listening? So I think that's very useful. But once again, it's only part of the language-focused learning part of that course. And so it's one part of 1/4 of the total course time. So I'm all in favor of it, but I want to see things kept in their perspective. Next question.
Great. Next question from Sukmavarti. She asked, how do you think of the teachers that spend a lot of time for doing administration much more, like lesson planning, preparing the props, teaching reports, than doing teaching activity with the students? How to cope the problems for taking a lot of time in teaching rather than doing lesson planning?
Well, my teacher, who was H.V. George, who taught in India, I think, and in Iraq, and also in Malaysia. One of his principles was, a good teacher is a lazy teacher. Teachers tend to think that you have to work hard. He argued that if you work hard as a teacher, then you are not the person who should be really doing the work, because you already know the language. The people who should be doing the work are the learners. And the teacher's job should be to make the learners do the most work, with the teacher doing the least amount of work. And so if we take something like extensive reading doesn't involve teaching, except when you begin to set up the extensive reading program. And so that means that once the teacher has organized the extensive reading program, the teacher is free to do whatever the teacher likes. And the teacher can sit down and read a book, or the teacher can get on and do some marking or something like that. But the learners are doing the work doing extensive reading. So lesson plans are okay, but lesson plans are often plans of the work that the teacher is going to do presenting to the learners. So, I have to say I don't get very excited about lesson plans, because I think you should actually have some idea of what you're going to do, but you should also see what happens in the classroom and be flexible about that. But if you go to a New Zealand primary school, for example, you'll see the teacher sitting quietly at the front of the room, or sitting with a pair of learners or an individual learner helping them, while the other learners are quietly getting on with the work that they know they have to do. And extensive reading is a great idea to show that. In extensive reading, each learner reads a book at the right level for them. They read quietly. If they have any problems with it, I suppose they could raise their hand to ask the teacher. But if they're having problems, it means they've chosen a book which is too difficult for them, and so they should probably choose an easier book. So it's quite interesting to go back over those 20 techniques that I've suggested at the beginning, and to say how many of these techniques actually involve the teacher teaching and how many simply involve the teacher giving the learners a bit of training in how to do the activity and then letting them get on with it. So a well-run classroom for me, and a really good teacher, is not a teacher who works hard at the front of the class. It's a teacher who sits back quietly and lets the learners get on with the work that they now know they have to do. Next question. I'm sorry if these answers don't
That's
please you,
wonderful.
but they're what I think.
That's wonderful. Much of the experience. So many questions, so I'm unable to choose what to ask and what not. So I want to teach my students reading with games, but games are limited and most take a lot of time. So how to deal with this problem, Professor?
Is this games, is it?
Yep, games.
Yeah, G-A-M-E-S.
Reading games.
Yeah, reading game. Yeah, well, once again, if it's a game, it probably doesn't involve a lot of reading. If it's a reading game, it probably involves small amounts of reading and the learners doing a lot of activity, either speaking to each other or something like that. Now, if your goal is reading, then that time on task principle I mentioned is important. And so in an extensive reading program, the learners should be reading several 100,000 words per year. Now that sounds like a lot, but when you break it down into how many minutes per day it is, per school day, for a 40-week year, to learn the first 2,000 words of English, the learners really only need to read like something about 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week, 40 weeks of the year, in order to read several 100,000 words. So once again, games make the learners happy. Games have the learners seeming to be active, but are they actually getting a lot of language input while they play these games? So once again, I don't get very excited about games. I want the learners to be doing lots of reading, lots of listening, doing lots of speaking and writing at the right level for them, plenty of time on task, and doing things which are actually going to get them having to make use of the language a lot. Next question.
Yeah, this one is from Yasin, and he asks, what is the role of incidental and accidental vocabulary activities in promoting speaking skills? Which one is more effective?
Sorry, incidental and intentional, is it?
Accidental. Accidental vocabulary.
Accidental. Yeah,
yep.
I haven't really seen it called accidental, but it probably is something like incidental learning. I think that when we compare incidental learning, that is learning through reading and listening, with deliberate learning wins every time, simply because you're focusing only on vocabulary and you learn what you focus on. But we have to see that incidental learning can account for large amounts of learning if there are large amounts of input. So I think that the incidental, accidental learning is a very important part of learning. But we know that in order for such learning to occur, there has to be a large number of repetitions. And the large number of repetitions for each word means probably at least a dozen and probably more than 20 repetitions and meetings for each word through incidental learning. And you only get that amount of repetition through large quantities of input. I wrote an article in 2015 which calculated how much input learners would have to get at various levels. And you can find that article on my website. I think the article is called "How Much Input Do We Need?" or something like that, do learners need? And so I think the incidental learning occurs through the meaning-focused input strand, the meaning-focused output strand, and the language-focused learning strand. So 3/4 of the time, should be spent in a language course which largely involves incidental, accidental learning. And 1/4 of the time, the language-focused learning strand should be spent on the deliberate, intentional learning. And I think that that's a good balance. Okay, next question.
Yeah, so next question, I cannot read the name, is Chinese or Japanese. So he asked that how to teach collocations to EFL students. Are there any recommended techniques or websites that I can use to teach collocations?
So this is collocation, is that right?
Yep. Yeah.
Collocation. So collocations are word groups. That's words that occur together with each other. And collocations include things like at the moment, take an exam, last night, and groups of words like that. Well, the answer is the same as how do you learn reading, how do you learn writing, how do you learn speaking, and so on. The answer is the 4 strands. How do you learn collocations? Well, you learn collocations by getting lots of meaning-focused input through listening and reading involving those collocations. And that should be about 1/4 of your learning time for collocations. And you learn collocations productively by having to speak and write material which allows you to use those collocations. And you learn collocations by deliberately focusing on collocations in the language-focused learning strand of the course. And learning collocations can be like the rote learning of vocabulary, where you set up a flashcard program such as Anki or Quizlet or something like that, which will help you, or I Know, which will help you with flashcard learning. Some of those programs are very good. And you put in the collocation and the translation into your first language, and you do deliberate learning of collocations. It's also very good to analyze collocations. So even though you want to learn a word group like last night, it's also important to know what each of the parts of the collocation mean, because most collocations, and this is 99% of them at least, have are what we call compositional, and that is the meaning of the parts contributes a great deal to the meaning of the whole collocation. So even though it's useful to develop fluency in collocations by knowing the whole collocation and focusing on the whole collocation, it helps memory and it helps the learning of the language to also analyze collocations. There are less than 100 collocations in English where the meaning of the parts don't seem to bear any relationship to the meaning of the whole. And if you look on my website, there's an article that I did with one of my PhD students, Lynn Grant, which talks about core idioms in English and gives you a list of these idioms where the meaning of the parts don't tell you the meaning of the whole. And there's less than 100 of them in English. People think that there are lots of them, but they're actually a very small group indeed. And the fourth way, so I've talked about input and output and deliberate study of collocations. I think one of the good ways or most effective ways of developing collocational knowledge hasn't yet been researched, but this is through fluency development. Because through fluency development, we have to perform faster than we would normally perform. And one of the ways that we become faster is by working with a unit which is larger than the unit we normally work with. So instead of working at the word level, our brain then has to work at the phrase level. And I think then that fluency development activities are probably great contributors to developing collocational knowledge. So with learning any aspect of language, such as grammar and vocabulary, collocation, pronunciation, spelling, and so on, you need to take a balanced view of it of seeing how does input help this, how does output help it, how does deliberate learning help it, and how does fluency development help with the learning of this material. Okay.
Wonderful.
Next question.
So maybe this is last question for this session, and certainly not enough time to have 1 hour with such a diverse, a person like you. So yeah, what is the role of a mother tongue on adult EFL learners learning English as a foreign language? Most adult EFL learners come up with a background knowledge of L1 and somewhat its impact on their learning. Do repetition and drills work well for them?
Well, I think the first language has a very strong influence on language learning, the first language of the learners. Any study of vocabulary knowledge shows that cognates or loan words are much easier to learn than words which have no relationship in form between the first language and the second language. So words which are shared between English and the first language are words which are very easy to learn. So clearly the first language has a strong effect on vocabulary learning. But part of learning vocabulary is learning meanings which are not the same as first language meanings. And this knowledge gradually develops as learners gain proficiency in the language. When learners are at a low level of proficiency, such as beginning and intermediate learners, then their language systems are, how would you say, they're not integrated. They share the same access to the language system. And so even if you don't want learners to translate when you're learning English as a foreign language, they will connect what is being learnt in the second language to their first language. And it's only when learners reach a high development of language proficiency that you seem to get separation of the language store for the first and the second language. So I think the first and second language relationship is a very important part of language learning. It has a great effect on the difficulty of language learning. The closer a language is related to English, the easier it will be to learn. So if you're a Swede or a Dane or a French or Spanish speaker learning English, then you are in a much easier position than if you're a speaker of Japanese or Indonesian or Turkish learning English, because there is not much shared between those languages. However, as a result of the internet and travel and all of those sorts of things, there is now a lot of borrowing from English going on in to other languages. I know in the Thai language, for example, there are a lot of English words which are now borrowed into Thai and become part of the Thai language. And I think it's useful for the teacher to make these connections between the first language and the second language, because seeing that you actually already know things which are English can help language learning. So I think the first language, second language relationship is very important for English as a foreign language. It's what makes it really different from learning English as a second language compared to a foreign language. Okay, next question.
What a treat it has been to listen to you, Professor Paul, for an hour and a half. So thanks very much for accepting our invitation and this webinar. So lastly, any message for our community of teacher development webinars? Any final words, any final thoughts?
Who are you asking?
For our community teacher development webinars, TLM.
Yes. Are you asking me a question?
I'm asking, any final words or final remarks for community teacher development webinars?
Oh, I see. Oh, I would just repeat what I've said before. If you're going to come to seminars and webinars and things like that, you should say, I'm going to make sure that I take at least one thing from this which is new or which I haven't tried before and do it in my class. And so it should almost become a principle for you that you don't just say, well, that kept me entertained for 1 hour, or that was interesting. You should say, I'm going to take one thing away and I'm going to try it. And if it doesn't work, I'll try it one more time. And then if it doesn't work the second time, then I know I was wasting my time. But I think that you should actually make this an opportunity to do something different in your class. So I'm very pleased to see that you organize such
That's
seminars
wonderful. What a
and hope that they
wonderful
bring about change.
message to end.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate that. You talked about extensive reading. We had a webinar with Dr. Thomas Robb on extensive reading and Dr. Doreen Nevert on extensive reading. So, for participants who didn't participate in that webinar, I've shared teacher development webinars YouTube channel. So you can go and watch the webinar there. The recording of this webinar will also be available at Teacher Development Webinars YouTube channel. So you can rewatch and share with your colleagues. It has been a wealth of knowledge, a lot of new ideas to take. And I really appreciate your presence, Professor Paul. It was great having you at Teacher Development Webinars.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the participants for their patience. Okay, bye.
Thanks very much. So for everyone who's asking for certificates, this webinar was free, but there is a reasonable amount, only rupees 300 for Pakistan nationals and some $5 for internationals to get your participant certificate. So for the payment method, you can contact us on info.edwebinars@gmail.com. We are, having interesting line of speakers for our future webinars too. So please keep following our social media channels. We are available on Twitter, and LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and of course our YouTube channel. Our Twitter audience is not so much, so we will definitely like to extend our family on Twitter and Instagram. So please follow us on our Twitter, Instagram, and most of us are available on our Facebook. 17,000 participants in our Facebook group from all over the world. And as I said today, we found people from 5 or 6 continents in this webinar, and it was really great to listen to you, Professor Paul. Thank you very much. I'll take leave. Please take care. Bye bye. See you next time.